two places in order to get it folded back under the chair. He's merging with the picture at the bottom. Now notice something else. So the naked model is standing behind her. We don't tend to see this. Again, if this were Poussin, we would see this easily. But it's Courbet, we don't expect to see it. Do you see the way his shoulder rhymes with her behind? Right? There's like a perfect rhyme between this and this. There's an off rhyme, a slant rhyme, as it were, between her breast and his head. Notice she too is doing something two-handed. Her left hand holds her drapery to her right hand is raised to her head. It's another two-handed operation. I'm suggesting that there's a very close relation between these figures. Instead of there being some strong sexually coded contrast between the active man and the contemplating, the admiring woman, no, they are going to be versions of the same thing. Now there's something else you can see. Look at the most beautiful relationship in the picture between the trees coming out of the hillside and the tilt of her head in her hand. You see that? And it's, again, a beautiful rhyme. So she's not just rhymed with Courbet, she's also rhymed with the painting. As if what Courbet is trying to get us to see is that the woman, the painter, the painting are all one thing. They're all merged together. Then notice something else. Inside the painting, what's going on? Water is flowing out towards the artist. So as the artist, and as you see this again and again in Courbet's landscapes and so on, seascapes, as he paints himself into the picture flows out towards him. We often see that flow out towards us in the Courbet painting. Sometimes the waves are coming towards us. But not only that, look here. What's that? That's the water. The waterfall is in her drapery. The waterfall is now beyond Courbet. Even that cap is like the water coming out of it. So at the very heart of this realist allegory is a picture. Something we can see. We have to interpret, but notice what interpretation means here. It just means seeing what's before your eyes. That he is painting at the center of this picture, himself in the act of painting himself into the picture, painting the woman into the picture, and the picture flowing out and engulfing them both. Right? At the center of this thing. Another way of thinking of the realism, it's as if I'm Courbet and I can do this thing, if I can enough paint who I am and in the act of painting myself into this picture, the world will then come forth in the painting. I will summon the world, not depict it, what it looks like out there, but it will just come. Right? And that's what's happened in that landscape. And this is the moment in America of Thoreau and Walden. It's a very interesting moment, right, the 50s. There are other expressions of this in the culture. Above all, there's the amazing American poet, Walt Whitman, who is, again, a poet of the body. He's almost like the same person as Courbet, but just in another country practicing another art. May I have the next slide, please? Let's just see what I provided. Okay. So I did all that so you could sort of see how a certain kind of project of something like merger, or call it immersion, works in Courbet. That's what he's trying to do. And that, in a way, was the background to my being able to see that something like that is there in Caravaggio, but more as a kind of first stage that then gets covered up or displaced by his second moment of shock and violence and separation. May I have the next slide, please? Another early probable self-portrait, the Bacchino Malato, so-called the sick Bacchus. That's just a name that a great art historian named Longhi gives it at a certain moment. Notice the same structure all over again. This same right angle, vis positif, we see the right hand holding the grapes. Of course, I'm suggesting that's really the painter's left hand. And the right hand, the other hand is actually back up there also. Giovanni, can you point to that? But it's very hard to believe it, you know, when you see it. Yeah, it's very hard to believe it. You almost feel that that other hand is out there in that blank space. Could I have the next slide, please? I'm drinking someone else's water. What's for me? So this is a wonderful painting of Caravaggio's. It got physically damaged a lot, and it's restored. It's called The Musicians, and it's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Again, it would have been made for one of these very, very rich collectors, Del Monte, in whose palace in Rome Caravaggio lived. And in Caravaggio, we start to see this very complicated structure of some figures turned away, a la Courbet, like the figure at the right, and others who face us. In Caravaggio, we get both, the turning away and the facing, as if the whole question of which way a painting faces is a real question for Caravaggio during these years. But his project, you could say, is more complex than Courbet's. I mean, it's in one sense less extreme. Courbet is really trying to just undo the separation between him and the painting. Caravaggio, in a sense, begins in the painting and then is going to try to separate, but the separation will turn out to be compromised and complex in various ways, and that's what one ends up seeing as one tracks his art. But here, I want you to notice the figure who looks out at the second figure from the right, who looks out at us from the background. He holds an instrument called a cornetto, and he looks at us. He is, again, Caravaggio. Could we have the next slide, please? Just to give you a detail. So Caravaggio has put himself into this picture. I mean, where he's had figures from the rear, which is the position he would have had as he made the picture. There'd be other figures facing us, as he could have seen himself in a mirror. And then this figure, and notice again, in a right angle relation to things, as if to emphasize the importance of this right angle piece positif. Could I have the next slide, please? So on the face of it, a very different picture. The famous Bacchus, right, in the Uffizi. A little later, called 1597, 1598. And there's the Bacchus extending a glass of wine to the viewer in his left hand. And there's also a flask of wine at the left, and so on. Of course, I want to invite you to see this as the question is not whether or not Caravaggio modeled for the Bacchus. It doesn't matter whether he modeled for the Bacchus. Quite probably he didn't model for the Bacchus, but I nevertheless see in this picture, with the wine in the left hand, something like a mirror reversed picture of Caravaggio making the picture, reaching towards the picture with his right hand holding the brush. It also turns out to be the case that if you go to the Uffizi and if you can sort of get permission, I went with Charles Dempsey and Elizabeth Cropper and Ruth, and we got powerful lights brought in. And we knew this because people have written about it. There is in the flask here, you can't see it in reproduction, a tiny reflection of a figure. And the figure seems to have even something like an easel in front of him. So we've got this little image of Caravaggio in the act of painting, probably in that flask. But there's something about the rest of the whole composition that I think this is a structure that occurs again and again in Caravaggio's paintings. These images of, as it were, himself, the painter, in the act of painting. Can we have the next slide? It will be a detail. Again, it's hard for me to convince you of this, but the wine has always been described. You see those sort of rings in the wine? It's kind of circles. They've always been seen as ripples in the wine. But a number of years ago, my friend Charles Dempsey, our friend Charles Dempsey, colleague of mine at Johns Hopkins and a great scholar, noticed and mentioned to me that if you look closely, and you can really see this, those aren't ripples in the wine. That's the glass of the wine glass. It has a kind of spiral character to the actual glass blowing. But it looks at first like ripples. And I want to say something like this. And notice the way the folds work in the drapery that you see. It's as if seeing the gesture, seeing the folds and the drapery, seeing the wine as concentric circles are all on the side of something like the process of painting. What I've been calling immersion, immersion. And then the moment when you suddenly see, no, it's not that. It's hard glass, spiral. That's like a little moment of shock, of the moment of what I'm calling the moment of specularity, specularité, separation. So it's as if those kinds of structures, in my account, sort of occur again and again and again in Caravage. Could we have the next slide, please? Make a huge leap. Could we, I want you, again, could we go back to, just go back to the Bacchus, right? We're looking at two completely different pictures, apparently, right? Here's the Bacchus from something like 1598. I want you just to take it in. He's holding the glass of wine. And now let's jump ahead to the board. Could we go ahead to, again, two things, that and then this? Thank you. Do you see how it's a version of the same picture? Right? Instead of a glass of wine, it's the head of Goliath. And it's a sword. This is the great David with the head of Goliath in the Borghese. Lots of scholars, probably most scholars now, want to make it very late. Sometimes they even like to see it as his last picture, 1610. I think that's, I don't believe that. There are a group of scholars, and I would link myself to them, who see it much more like probably 1606, maybe very shortly after he committed the murder that forced him to leave Rome. It doesn't matter, but it sort of matters. I don't think this is the very, very end. But what I want you to see is something like the same structure, where a left hand extends something toward us. Right? And here it's as if the head stands for the whole picture. I'll go further. In Caravaggio and in the Caravagisti, decapitation, the cutting off of the head, happens again and again and again. I even want to say it's something like it's the basic subject matter of painting in Rome at this moment in Caravaggio's circle, and that's going to go on for a while. And what that's about, what the cutting off of the head is about, is the cutting out of the gallery picture. The struggle of Caravaggio and his moment is the struggle for the emergence now of a new kind of fully autonomous gallery picture, what's going to become the basis of the easel picture, the fundamental vehicle of modernity, against the fresco, against what Mannerism has been doing. Right? As if part of the project is to establish painting as autonomous. Autonomous does not yet mean unity. We're not talking about unity. Unity is not going to come back for another 20 years. It's not going to matter until Poussin and the commentary on Poussin. By the time when we get to Poussin and after Poussin, autonomy means unity. I'm probably throwing much too much at you right now. But this is the moment of something like autonomy as such, and that gets defined as a kind of cutting, a kind of, you could say, a decapitation of the picture. It even is going to involve for Caravaggio trying to cut the picture loose from him. So the painting of him that he keeps turning up in the pictures, as here he is in the head of Goliath, I want to say is not primarily because of some drive to put himself in the picture, but a kind of, in a way, inevitable failure of a project of cutting the picture away from him, separating himself from the picture. through a kind of depiction of violence, which nevertheless then ends up re-inscribing him in the picture. Again, I know I'm throwing much too much at you, but this is just I'm trying to suggest what can be at stake in this kind of painting, okay? How extraordinary the issues can be, all right? How far they can go, how much beyond what we normally think of could be at stake in these paintings. Could I have the next slide, please? Just to show you another late decapitation picture. Salome with the head of John the Baptist. This is probably about 1609, 1 year before the end. And this is in the National Gallery in London. There again, this severed head, the presentation, you could say, of the head as the presentation of the painting. And notice, I mean, again in Caravaggio, we get these strange doubled figures. I mean, look at the way in which Salome, looking away, looking off canvas, is doubled with her maid, this older woman, who is completely fascinated by the head. And not only fascinated, but can you see that she kind of doubles the head? It's as if their expressions, their faces, as if they're the same face. Right? As if the identification, the mimesis, to use that language, is so powerful. And it's as if Caravaggio is exploring that always. He's exploring his mimesis with what's happening in the picture, then his revulsion, his reaction from it, then a counter-reaction. Again and again, the paintings are profound exploration of something like the act of painting these paintings, which also means the act of trying to establish the painting as an autonomous object in the world. Right? The last chapter of my book on Caravaggio is called something like The Internal Structure of the Pictorial Act. Could we have the next slide, please? This is Caravaggio's last painting, as far as we know. And it's amazing. It's the Martyrdom of St. Ursula. You can't go see this. This belongs to a bank in Naples. And it only reemerges from the vaults of the bank on selected occasions. So this is Ursula, who is at the head of an army of 10,000 virgins, and they've been captured by the Huns, and this is the king of the Huns on the left. And he proposes marriage to Ursula, and she says no, and he takes that very hard, and he kills her. And that's the scene of her martyrdom. He's just fired an arrow into her breast at this kind of astonishingly close range. And there are 5 figures: the king, then that other figure we see to his right, then Ursula, then a man immediately behind Ursula, and then a guy in armor. The man immediately behind Ursula, could you give me the next slide, please? It's going to be another version of this. It might be... It's less good in some ways, but it's better in other ways. Because this is the picture after it was cleaned. And you can see, for example, that this figure has his hand down here, as if he's trying to intervene, to prevent something. And that wasn't visible before. There's the arrow going into Ursula. And then there is this figure. And could we have the next slide, please? No, go back. I'm sorry. My fault. That... no, go forward one. Let's stay with this. That is, again, Caravaggio himself. So imagine that what's at stake here. I mean, here's Caravaggio, immediately behind Ursula, right? It's as if he's almost embracing her. You have to imagine her body right up against him. And it's as if he's peering over her shoulder to see the firing of the arrow into Ursula. One way of thinking of this weirdly close distance that all this is taking place in the painting would be to think of it as painting distance, as if it's trying to capture the sense of the close distance of a painter to the painting that he or she is making. And in that case, you would think of the act of killing Ursula as the same as the act of making the painting, and the executioner then becomes a certain figure for the painter. But we also have the figure of Caravaggio straining as if he wants to see the beginning of the act of painting in the act of the king. But the king also has this amazing expression on his face. Because we have the next slide, please. A kind of almost like shock or horror. He's reacting already to what he's done to Ursula, who's looking down at her thing. So you see what happens to considerations of time and temporality in a picture like this. They're not anything you could make into a kind of ordinary narrative. So it's as if what Caravaggio is seeing, Caravaggio, who is of course the painter, is he's seeing not only something like some kind of figure for the beginning of the act of painting, but he's already seeing the reaction of this king to have what he is, which would also be his own reaction, right? So what we see is a kind of set of identifications, counter-identifications, in, out, back and forth, all of this getting worked out now in terms of a metaphorics of the act of painting itself, understood as a kind of act of killing. And then on the armor of this king, we see this lion, this brilliant reflections in this lion. And the lion, of course, is a kind of allegorical figure for the sun, for light. It's like the condition of possibility of painting. And the whole thing taking place in this very black field. So it's as if this last painting of Caravaggio's, with Courbet we have that real allegory of 1855. It's as if here too we have some kind of astonishing, radical, real allegory of the entire project of Caravaggian painting, understood now in these extremely complex, violent terms. This is probably a good, I've been going for about, an hour and a half anyway, if not longer. It's probably a good place to stop. So thank you for your attention.